Recording will start soon. I don't know if there's anything to present, but might as well present so that you guys don't have to be names on camera. So we have some things to chat about. And it begins with meritocracy. So meritocracy is an ideology. All ideologies are sets of beliefs and values, the way you see the world as it is, as it always has been and always should be. Meritocracy, right at the beginning, has the word merit. And therefore, it gives us a clue as to what is the foundation, what is the cornerstone of this ideology. And it's the ideology based upon promoting people not on their lottery of birth, like feudalism, but on merit. So it's the idea that those people in government should be there because they're most capable. Those people in positions of command within the military should be there because they are most capable. And we really were introduced to the term meritocracy in Social 20 when we saw Napoleon. Napoleon, although born a noble, a lesser aristocrat, he saw that many of the positions within the military were close to him because he was a lesser noble, or close to people that were very capable, but not born into a wealthy noble family. So one of the reforms that he introduced in the Napoleonic reforms, this is lesson 3, Social 20, was introduction of meritocracy. And meritocracy is a step towards equality, liberty, equalite, fraternity, that the French Revolution was attempting to create. How is it a step towards equality? Well, there should be equal opportunity for you to serve as a general, or equal opportunity for you to be president. And if those positions were positions determined by the lottery of birth, determined by the divine right, then unfortunately, even if you're very capable, you won't be able to have those positions. So meritocracy, talk briefly about it, is just an ideology based upon merit. Now, very rarely will you see it on a Part B exam, but you could talk about meritocracy politically, economically, socially as what could be the foundation of society. Many people would argue that democracy is flawed because rule by all doesn't mean everyone is equally capable. For example, my friends, there's an opportunity for you to be tried by a judge, or an opportunity for you to be tried by a jury of your peers. Well, research shows that jury is often more prone to flaws like racism and prejudice that may predetermine the outcome of the trial. Whereas the judge has specific training, specific experiences, specific guidance and understanding of the legal code that makes the judge probably a more effective judge. So even though a jury might be a more democratic way for you to be tried by your peers, doesn't mean it's a better way. Another way to look at meritocracy is from the lens of Plato. And he had a book about living on a ship, and it talks about philosopher kings. And simply put, the idea is not everybody is made to be a navigator. Not everybody is made to be an oarsman. Not everybody has the ability to be in command. So we don't randomly rotate people through these positions. If you're naturally gifted in one of those areas, that should be how you serve the ship. And that's the essence of meritocracy. You look down south to the United States right now at the 2 presidential candidates, Biden and Trump. I might be so bold as saying that neither of them deserve to be president, and neither of them are capable of being a strong president. And that is one of the reasons the United States is in flux today, is because democracy is flawed. And the United States is weak because of it. Not only does democracy create tribalism, but it also promotes sometimes the popular. And I don't know how those two men are popular, but it often promotes the popular, but not the capable. So meritocracy, I've said it before in class, it's my favorite ideology. As a teacher, I mean, it's my job to assess and to grade students. So in a classroom, it is a meritocracy that I grade you, and as I grade you, I'm discriminating based upon capability. That's meritocracy. Even though it's kind of a derogatory term in some crowds because it starts sounding like social Darwinism and fascism, I would argue it is not. Meritocracy doesn't mean, white, bald men are more capable. In fact, meritocracy has no ethnic, no gender, no socioeconomic preconditions. It's just about ability. So if the best hockey player in the world happens to be a Nigerian female, I still want her on the Edmonton Oilers. The Oilers shouldn't be exclusive to one gender, one ethnicity, one socioeconomic class, one religion. I want the best hockey player on the ice so that we can win a cup. And that mentality should be the same for everything. I don't want my doctor chosen based upon some kind of affirmative action. This doctor didn't really pass med school, but we haven't had somebody of this specific groupings of gender and socioeconomics and religion and ethnicity. So we push them through med school so that we can see how woke we are. That's not meritocracy, and that's not your best doctor. Your best doctor may, unfortunately, be a white male, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't get to go through med school. So meritocracy doesn't judge people on anything other than just ability. Now, you can make the argument that the natural flaw of meritocracy is that socioeconomic status can impact your ability to perform. I have made it clear that I grew up in extreme poverty, and there are times that people that had a house, had breakfast, they could probably perform at a higher level than I did. Because they were fed and secure, they could focus on that math lesson, and maybe I had more difficulty focusing. But in the end, I should get the same test. That's meritocracy. So meritocracy based on merit. Does this relate to Edmund Burke or classic liberalism or both? Wow. What does meritocracy relate to? I would say that it doesn't relate to Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke, for the sake of this course, is just classic conservative. Classic conservative, not meritocracy. Plato, Napoleon, that's meritocracy. Edmund Burke, classic conservatism. Are there some things about meritocracy that Edmund Burke might approve of? Perhaps, but Edmund Burke is also at a time where he's clinging to a little bit of feudalism. And what is meritocracy? It's a rejection of feudalism. Burke doesn't talk about how we should unleash the most capable. He's talking about maintaining tradition. And at that time of the late 18th century, tradition was that people could be predetermined by God through a lottery of birth. So how does it relate to Edmund Burke? It challenges many of those assumptions of Burke that we should maintain tradition, that we should continue to apply the same doctrine, the same solutions that we've been using for generations to recurring or new problems. So Burke would not be labeled as a proponent of meritocracy. How does it relate to classic liberalism? Again, if you look at meritocracy as, one of the ideas coming from Plato, Plato is, a couple of thousand years before we use the term classic liberalism. So I don't want to muddy the waters and say that meritocracy is classic liberalism because, Plato's his writings are before the time of Christ, and classic liberalism, that's the 18th century. So how does it connect to classic liberalism? They're both ideologies. They both try to promote the wealth, the value of the individual. Meritocracy is measuring the wealth of individuals and saying not every individual is equal, whereas classic liberalism, to some extent, doesn't do that, right? Classic liberalism would say politically everyone has the freedom of speech. Meritocracy would add to that, but some are more capable of talking, and we should listen to them first. So meritocracy and classic liberalism, although connected, are not the same thing. Classic liberalism economically is capitalism, right? So from an economic standpoint, classic liberalism is capitalism. Meritocracy should be the foundation of a capitalist society. Thinking about it, right? So if there's, a dozen restaurants in the great city of Wetaskiwin, and let's say that there's a dozen Korean restaurants, all offering the same cuisine, and there's one that's really good, 5 that are okay, and 6 that you're probably going to get food poisoning if you go there. In a free market, consumers should be able to vote with their feet, vote with their dollars, and they should be able to frequent the restaurants that provide the best product, the best service. And those that continually make their customers sick, they should be forced into bankruptcy because no one's shopping there because of the poor food, or forced to change, right? Find a new niche or get better at what they're doing. So the foundation of capitalism is meant to be merit. That if people offer to a free market a product, a good or a service that is seen as desirable by others, then they should prosper. That's the invisible hand. That's economic freedom. That's the basis of the wealth of a nation. That the basic economic questions, what to produce, how to produce, and who to allocate it to, will be answered through the invisible hand of greed. So I'm a greedy person, and I want to be wealthy so that I can have a comfortable lifestyle. Then it's in my self-interest to offer a product, a good or a service to my community that I can get paid handsomely for. And if I go and I offer something and nobody wants it, I better offer something else. And now everybody's buying it. And that kind of innovative, responsive thinking, creating a product that people either want or need, should lead to more wealth, more happiness for all. That's how, through my own self-interest, invisible hand, I help others. It's not my intention to make everyone's lives better, but I make their lives better by trying to make my life better. And the essence of it is merit. We shouldn't be buying products that are inferior. So if the good people at General Motors and Ford and Chrysler, Dodge keep putting out inferior vehicles, at some point you should be like, you know what? I'm going to buy a Volkswagen. I'm going to buy a BMW. I'm going to buy an Audi. I'm going to buy a Toyota. I'm going to buy a Honda. I'm not going to keep buying Dodge just because they are, our local company. I'm going to buy the best vehicle. Meritocracy is connected to capitalism. Is meritocracy connected to the political, social side of liberalism? Not as easily. So whenever I think of classic liberalism, I often divide it into those economic, political, and social subcategories. And I think it lends itself easily to economic, but it doesn't lend itself as easily to political classic liberalism. Political classical liberalism is the idea of democracy, and democracy isn't necessarily meritocracy. Now, we haven't studied democracy yet. That's chapter 10, but we're getting there quickly, aren't we? But I'm going to muddy the waters a little bit. What did democracy look like in the 19th century? What did it look like? Well, democracy at the time of John Locke, democracy at the time of Edmund Burke, because there was some democracy in England, wasn't democracy as we see it today. Democracy then was for basically rich white guys. Now, rich white guy democracy, meaning that you had to own property to get the right to vote. You had to be male to get the right to vote. It may look like meritocracy if merit is defined by gender and socioeconomic status. And to some in the early 19th century, maybe that's how they determined merit, that they thought that men were more capable than women, that rich people were more capable than poor. But the true nature of meritocracy is it's not based on gender. It's not based on socioeconomic status. It's based on ability. So although some may try to defend classic liberalism of the 19th century democratically, saying limited democracy, limited to just white men that own property, is an example of meritocracy because they are more capable, from the advantage point of 2024, we see that just as sexist, racist, and very limiting. That's not meritocracy. That's a flawed democracy. All right. Is it accurate to connect classic liberalism with John Locke? You better believe it, baby. So John Locke writes a book called On Liberty. And if there is a father of classic liberalism, much like Karl Marx is the father of authoritarian socialism that others call Marxism after him, or much like Adam Smith is the father of laissez-faire capitalism. If there's a father, a guru, a Yoda, if you will, a central person connected to classic liberalism, not just economically, because that's Marx, or sorry, that's Smith, but classic liberalism politically, classic liberalism socially. If there's one person, it's John Locke. So is it accurate to connect John Locke with classic liberalism? You better do that. You better be doing that. Yep. And is it accurate to connect modern liberalism with John Stuart Mill? Going back, when I see modern liberalism, I think economics. Freedom through government, right? Modern liberalism, not freedom from, freedom through. And the easiest expression of that is modern liberalism, economic modern liberalism. Economic modern liberalism is practiced by President FDR, and that's your lesson today, and his New Deal. That's a policy of relief, recovery, reform through the government. Government's going to get more involved in your economic lives so that you can be free of hunger, free of despair and want and fear. Modern liberalism, politically and socially, a lot more difficult thing to look at. So freedom through government, meaning that we are only free because government's doing something for us politically. So although we have natural rights, we need a government to have a constitution to ensure that I have the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, these things. To some extent, John Stuart Mill does fit into that category, because you could argue that John Stuart Mill protects your freedom from the incursion of other people's freedom. So John Stuart Mill, really one big thing, the harm principle, that your freedom is only limited if it harms anyone else. So from a modern liberal perspective, how do I keep my right to property? Well, then we must limit your freedom of movement as you encroach upon my property. So government creates legislation to limit your freedom of movement so that you don't encroach upon my property. That legislation is a modern liberal piece protecting my private property rights, protecting my privacy from your freedom of movement. So even though you have the freedom of movement, and you should be allowed to move all you want, up to the point that your freedom has a negative impact on my freedom of privacy. So there are countries where it's completely legal for you to go and camp in people's backyard without talking to them, without their permission. In Canada, that is not legal, although the police seem to be looking the other way a lot in big cities where we have a lot of houseless people that are creating temporary encampments in people's backyards without their permission. But if somebody has a temporary encampment in your backyard, let's say it's me. So I create a little temporary encampment in your backyard, and temporary might be days or weeks or even months. That is an incursion on your privacy. You can see me right out the window, and I can see you through the window, and I'm camping there, right? And it's also an incursion on your private property, because now there's parts of your property that you can't actually enjoy. You know, maybe you want to play soccer in your backyard, but you can't play soccer because my tent's right in the middle of your backyard. So now your property rights have been infringed upon by my movement rights. I have the freedom of movement. So John Stuart Mill would say that it's logical, it's rational, it's reasonable, and it's the government's duty, therefore, to limit my movement rights when it negatively interferes with your property rights. And if they create a piece of legislation that is a law, then that's modern liberalism, freedom through government. Briefly talk about neocons. Neoconservatism is coming up in tomorrow's lesson, but I can certainly talk about it. It's conservative, it's neo. Neo means new conservatives. Rather than saying classic conservatives like Burke, we need to make a distinction. These are not the 18th century conservatives. These are the 20th century conservatives. They're neocons, neoconservative. The textbook does an okay job in chapter 8 talking about neocons. When we think of neocons, we need to think of Reagan and Thatcher. We need to think of things in the United States like this movement in the 1970s and 1980s, where people are saying, you know what, this hippie thing, this women's liberation thing, We're not on board with it. We want to maintain tradition. We want to maintain our connection with religion. We want to be saying the Lord's Prayer at school. We want to be saying the Pledge of Allegiance at school. Those are neocons. Neocons are also Americans that believe they have a manifest destiny to not only rule America, but use their military to maintain their quality of life and standard of living. So if that means going to a war in Iraq to ensure that they have access to Saudi and Iraqi oil, then yippee-ki-yay, we're going to do it. So neocons is a word politically to refer to conservatives in the United States, Republicans in the United States, that they want to protect traditions as seen in the mid to late 20th century. Neocons economically really should be called neolibs. So in the textbook, they don't make the distinction. On tests, we often don't make the distinction. But in reality, neocons should be called neolibs, neoliberals. But the word liberal in the United States sounds like a swear word. Because liberal, that butts up against socialism. Socialism sounds like communism, and suddenly you're the enemy. So neocons, active during the Cold War, when the United States is at war with communism, they don't want to identify themselves with the word liberal at all. So even though they're not liberal politically or socially, they are very liberal economically because neocons believe in Adam Smith. But they're not going to use the word liberal to identify themselves because it sounds like they're saying that they're in favor of gay rights, that they're in favor of women's rights, that they're in favor of big government helping out with the evolution of political and social society, right? Inclusivity and plurality and tolerance and all these things that conservatives are like, no, let's slow down all these changes. America is becoming a hellhole. So neocons economically are actually neolibs, and that sounds very confusing. But it's because the word liberal isn't really one that they want to identify with. But I would say economically, they want to go back to capitalism. So they're capitalist. But politically, they want to slow the political and social change. They have faith in their military. They have faith in their government. They have faith in God. And they want government to be small, but they want government to protect things like the Second Amendment. They want government to maintain the foundation of America. And that foundation may have an ethnic component. So neocons are often also at least inwardly racist in the sense that they're probably anti-immigration and xenophobic. And now I've offended everyone. But yeah, so neocons are going to be focused on a little bit more in the next chapter. Can we go over welfare capitalism and industrial paternalism? Industrial paternalism is a term that you're less likely to see between the two. And this is a response to the flaws of classic liberalism economically. And the flaws are workers are living in poverty. They're living in slums. That the workers are not being paid enough to have a livable wage. And some are suggesting maybe the government needs to do more to regulate the marketplace. That would be a modern liberal solution. And some of the capitalists, they're saying, whoa. We don't want government to jump into our laissez-faire sandbox because we are thriving, right? These are, the titans of industry like Rockefeller and Carnegie and Vanderbilt and Henry Ford. So Henry Ford, recognizing that if he doesn't do something, the government's going to do something, he says, you know what? Let me solve this. I'm going to pay my workers $5 a day, even though the market doesn't demand that. I'm going to pay them more than market value because I understand that by doing it, it's going to help me. If you're a happy worker, you'll be more productive. And if you're happy and productive, you're more likely to stay here. I won't have to retrain you. I won't have to retrain others as I have, workers migrating in and out. I also have to recognize that the workers of America are those who now I can sell cars to. So I've sold cars to all the rich people, but I still want to keep selling cars. So I need to get a new market, and the market is the workers. So Henry Ford creates is credited with creating the middle class in America by paying workers more than the market demanded, meaning that, you know, his competitors were not paying that much. But he understood that it actually helped him because then he could sell more product, and that his workers would be more productive because they'd be happy and they wouldn't be migrating from workplace to workplace. There would be loyalty. That's industrial paternalism. When will you use it? Maybe in an economic essay saying that, you know, one way to resolve the challenges of capitalism is to rely upon industrial paternalism. But then you might have to acknowledge how naive that is, because not everybody is Robert Owen or Henry Ford, who actually are benevolent to their workers. That for every Owen and Ford that are out there, we have other employers that are happy paying 10 cents an hour because 10 cents an hour is just enough to pay for the rice that people need to eat, and also will maximize the profit that Nike gets by using sweatshops in Indonesia. Welfare capitalism. Welfare capitalism, we know the word capitalism. Welfare is the idea that the state, it's like modern liberalism, the state has to inject itself into the your economic and social and political, but mostly economic outcomes, that the state needs to be part of resolving any economic hardships that you have. Welfare capitalism, in terms of a spectrum, if capitalism's on the right and socialism's on the left, welfare capitalism is capitalism moving towards socialism. So welfare capitalism, we might see it as this step towards a mixed economy, an economy where it's a mix of individualism and collectivism. Welfare capitalism could be used to describe any government that has policies in place to try to stabilize people's economic reality. So looking at Canada, there's evidence that Canada could be called a welfare capitalist state. We have capitalism, we have private property, we have economic freedom, we have competition, we have the essence of a free market, but there's also a layer of support from government, of welfare. We have AISH, we have CERB, we have unemployment insurance, we have government subsidies and bursaries, we have minimum wage, we have security for old age security, we have pensions and all of these things. Those are layers of welfare created by the state. So welfare capitalism is one way to talk about a mixed economy where there's some individualism, capitalism, and some collectivism, welfare. So it's not socialism. We haven't gone all the way, and it's certainly not Marxism because there's still the capitalism component. So it's a hybrid. It's a step towards that. So the nice thing about economics is that, there's only maybe 8 concepts. And as soon as you can say, okay, these things all mean the same thing, there's less to know. So for example, capitalism is also laissez-faire. It's also the free market system. It's the price system. It's based on private property. It's Adam Smith's thing. It's classic economic liberalism. As soon as I think about these 7 things, at least, I'm thinking about all the same thing. It's easy to study, right? So I'm a person who, in my notes or in my head, I'm webbing things. So I have at the center of it this idea of economic individualism, and surrounding that I have all of these related ideas that are interchangeable to some extent. So welfare capitalism, in the sense of that conversation, it'd be part of that mix of individualism and collectivism. You have welfare capitalism. So pretty similar to things that we'll call like demand side economics or Keynesian economics or FDR's New Deal. They all kind of look like welfare capitalism. Those are the questions that were sent to me, and I absolutely appreciate them, because without them, I would have had very little to do. So now what I want to do is preview what you're doing today. And I believe what you're doing today is lessons 7 and 8. So I am going to jump into lesson 7. The Great Depression. Great Depression, economically speaking, is our most important case study. At least in terms of liberalism. That in terms of non-liberalism, it's going to be Stalin and the 5-year plans. But economically speaking, the testability here is huge. You should expect to see the Great Depression multiple choice. You should expect to see it on an A1, and there's always room to talk about it in an essay about economics. So it is an important case study. What do you need to know? You need to know the causes of the Great Depression. You need to know, how these causes are connected to classic liberalism. Then you need to understand how classic liberalism didn't provide a solution to the Great Depression. Hoover in the States, Bennett in Canada, they tried to keep business as usual, and it wasn't enough. And then you have to understand the shift towards the middle, economic middle, the shift towards mixed economy that is the New Deal. You should understand relief, recovery, reform, and you should be able to pick out some alphabet agencies to talk about it in an essay. And this is for both Dash 1 and Dash 2, because in Dash 2, you have to write about the role of government in the economy in an assignment 2 as well. So you should be able to say, this is what the AAA did. This is the relief, recovery, reform that the CCC did, or the TVA did, or the TWA did. So you do have to play the alphabet soup game and begin to learn some of these alphabet agencies, and not just this is what they did, but attach it to relief, recovery, or reform, and attach that concept to modern liberalism. Also, we're going to be seeing that term demand-side economics and Keynesian economics. So there's quite a bit there. That, my friends, is lesson 7. With lesson 7, there's lots of rich visuals. And here's a long quote, but there's visuals, there's graphs, there's photographs, there's cartoons. And anytime something's in green, there's the difference between classic and modern liberalism right there in the green box. Anytime things are in green, it's like, this is on a test. So I can't make my notes any more clear. So there's versions of the test, the A1 test for the Dash 1s. That's one of the 3 sources. There's versions of the multiple choice test. That's a part of the multiple choice exams. There's versions of the A2 test for Dash 2s, where that's one of the sources. Same thing with this. So as you go through it and you see a source in green, you should unpack what the heck's happening here. Not only do we need to know the story of what happened in the United States, but we need to know the story about what happened in Canada. How bad was the Great Depression? How did the government respond? And in Canada, you'll need to know things like the On to Ottawa trek and the Regina riots. So that, my friends, is lesson 7. It's going to take you some time to get through it. You might not get through it before 11 o'clock. And then we have lesson 8. Lesson 8 is modern economic liberalism. So classic economic liberalism, capitalism. Modern economic liberalism, mixed economy, Keynesian economics. This is FDR. So the reality is, though, that even though we shift towards mixed economics in the 1930s in both the United States and in Canada, not everybody loves the shift, right? And some of the legacies of modern economic liberalism are good, some are bad. So we have some ideas. This is modern economic liberalism. This is what we get because of it. This is why we pay taxes. Taxes are part of it, but government serving us is a part of it. So within this document, you'll see arguments in favor of it and arguments against. And you should make note of that, because both the Dash 1 and the Dash 2 crowd, you're going to be challenged with, economically speaking, what role should the government play in the economy? And there's layers like healthcare to that role. And how will you be introduced to an ideological perspective about healthcare? Cartoons like this. Is this cartoonist saying modern liberalism is good or bad? That's for you to unpack. So by 11 o'clock, if there's a cartoon in lesson 8 that you don't understand, or if there's a concept in lesson 7 or 8, or a policy in lesson 7 or 8 that you don't understand, you might want to ask me about it. So you have an hour and 25 minutes. You definitely have an hour and 25 minutes of work to do. So I'm going to stop recording, but I'll stick around and see if you have any other questions.